and this is AIM, the Natives Fight Back. The formation of AIM was a turning point in the fight for Native American rights and recognition. The American Indian Movement from 1969 to 1975 stood as a turning point in the way Native Americans were perceived in the U.S. AIM garnered national attention to protests like the occupation of Alcatraz, the Cherokee Treaties, and the Women in the Occupation. AIM is an organization that brings things like broken treaties, police brutality, and stolen land. It began as a grassroots movement in 1968 in response to police brutality and racial profiling, and would later become the turning point behind the Indigenous Civil Rights Movement or the Red Power movement. Many cultural battles were raging prior to the formation of AIM. There were Indian fishing right battles going on in Washington and Oregon, Iroquois land protests going on in Ontario and New York, and some Red Power activity coming off the West Coast. There was a Termination Act in 1953, where Native Americans were forced off the land and the land sold. Next came the Relocation Act in 1956, where Native Americans were forced to move to cities such as Salt Lake City, Chicago, and Minneapolis, where they faced poor housing conditions, segregation, and discrimination. Boarding schools continued to expand and change the way natives lived, forcing them to become assimilated into American culture. A native named Crazy Horse once said, "We do not interfere with you." And again, you say, "Why not become civilized? We do not want your civilization." Hello, my name is Dennis Banks, and I'm the founder of the American Indian Movement. In 1966, I was sent to the Stillwater, Minnesota State Prison for 5 years for stealing groceries to feed my family. In prison, I researched all the movements going on around the world, and realized that natives didn't have a movement, only small local protests. When I was released from prison in May 1968, I called my friend from a Native American boarding school, George Mitchell. I said, "George, I want to get a movie going, and I would like you to help me." I figured out with the two of us, we could set up meetings with the American Indian community in Minneapolis to make the change that we needed. We started working in the summer of 1968 by contacting all the natives we knew and went to the Indian slums in the city. We handed out 500 leaflets we printed to every native we could find and told them we need to have a meeting. Our first meeting was on July 28, 1968, in the basement of our church. When the meeting started, we had almost 200 people there. I said to them, "People are fighting battles on the streets of Chicago. They're fighting to stop the Vietnam War and trying to bring about changes in the political system. They're fighting in the streets of Alabama to change the situation of blacks. The SDS movement is trying to change the whole structure of universities. What are we going to do? Are we going to sit here in Minnesota and not do a thing? Are we going to go on for another 200 years the way we are without doing something for our Indian people?" The meeting continued and more people started to speak up. A man named Clyde Bellicor spoke about police brutality. He said, "When he proposed to go down the Franklin Avenue to all those Indian bars where the cops abuse our people every night, I said to him, we could go down there tomorrow morning." "No," he said, Let's go down there right now, tonight." In that meeting, Clyde spoke with such intensity it swept over us like a storm. At that moment, the idea of AIM was born. That night, we held protests about police brutality. We immediately made Clyde Bellicor our first chairman. We first wanted to deal with the police brutality. Only 10% of Minneapolis' population were native, but 70% of inmates in city jails were also native. George Conn and I painted our cars red. We established an Indian patrol to stop harassment. This idea was based off the Black Panthers and Oakland. I rejected violence. And other methods that involved force like Black Panthers, but I knew we would do whatever we had to complete our goals. I don't want AIM to be seen as a group that advocated violence. But on the other hand, I don't want us going against heavily armed versus cops empty-handed. We first went to the chief of police, but he said, "No, there's no racism here." We told him, "We'll prove it to you." We began carrying walkie-talkies wearing identical red berets. We went down to the Indian bars and recording them arresting our people and hitting with nice things. Later, we emptied all Indian customers from the bar. By the time the cops showed up, there was nobody left to arrest. The number of arrests had dropped dramatically. AIM would go on to do bigger and more impactful protests. In just 2 years after it started, there already had 5,000 people. Well, one of AIM's biggest and most memorable protests is the occupation of Alcatraz. Hello, my name is Richard Oakes, and I was the leader of the Alcatraz occupation in 1969. Our first attempt to take down was with a handful of people on November 9, 1969. We stayed one night before we were removed by authorities. In response to being removed, I talked to the San Francisco Chronicle and said, "If a one-day occupation of white men in Indian land years ago established squatters' rights, then the one-day occupation of Alcatraz should establish Indian rights to the land. We tried again November 20th, with a power of 89 men, women, and children, and we were finally able to take Alcatraz Island. We tagged the moon's graffiti like Red Power and Custer had it coming. We even got a lighthouse with peace and freedom, welcome home a free Indian land. We claimed the island was ours by right discovery, and offered to buy it for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, the same price that was offered them for the island of Manhattan. We're going to fall like it happened if President Nixon's administration tried to remove us from the island. His administration decided to leave us alone, as long as we made peaceful. In time, government officials came in the island to negotiate with us, but were never successful. Eventually, the population of Alcatraz grew to 600 natives, and a governing council was formed. We soon got a clinic, a kitchen, a public relations department, a nursery, and a grade school filled with children. We even got a security group called the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs. It was a plainly much hated Bureau of Indian Affairs. They patrolled the shore checking for intruders. We even got a radio show called Radio Free Alcatraz with my child Judo. During 1969, the occupation was going better than I could have ever expected. By 1970, that would change. College students had to leave, continue their studies, and replaced by beggars, care more about living a rent-free life than the original cause. Things only got worse in January 1970, when my daughter fell down the prison stairwells to her death. Because of the accident, my wife and I was Alcatraz. Soon, it would become a fight to the island. In May, President Nixon's administration called power to the island. And a few weeks later, a fire spread across the island, destroying lots of its historic buildings. On June 11th, 1971, federal marshals were sent down the island and removed the remaining natives. The 19-month occupation had been a big push for Hayden, and is one of the many important occupations. Hello, it's me again, Dennis Banks. A few years after the occupation of Alcatraz, Ames set their eyes on a new place, Wounded Knee. After our actions, Tribal President Dick Wilson had banned all activities on the Pine Ridge Reservation. They considered his ways of being corrupt, held by having an occupation at Wounded Knee caused a federal investigation to be launched in his administration. We also hoped for an investigation to be launched on the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Market Treaties. We also chose Wounded Knee because it was of major historical significance. It's where the Battle of Wounded Knee was, a massacre of Lakota natives by the U.S. Army. On February 27th, 1973, about 200 inland Sioux took Wounded Knee and were able to take 11 of Duke Wilson's allies hostage. The next day, we tried gunfire at federal marshals, and I started negotiations to release the hostages. I demanded the launch investigation on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Broken Treaties, and all reservations in South Dakota. Our occupation was less than 1 days, and ended because the White House agreed to investigate our complaints. During that time, 2 Sioux men were shot and killed. Russell means I arrested afterwards, but then released by a federal judge. In the courts, some tribes won settlements from federal and state governments, with some even including tribal land claims. For example, in 1971, a Chippewa family challenged an unexpected property tax bill they received from the county contained the reservation. The case went up to the Supreme Court. This case opened up the door for tribes to open up gambling establishments, which are seen as a potential for immense amounts of income. Ames also led the laws, such as NAGPRA, or the Native American Grave Protection and Restoration Act, which like places like museums and universities have returned anything they had, like bones and artifacts of tribes. In 1974, a gathering was called for by Ames for all indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere to meet in South Dakota. Over 98 nations arrived and formed an International Indian Treaty Council, which was then recognized by the UN later that year. When many of its leaders in prison, Ames would have disbanded in 1978. Small groups continued to function in our local court, but the U.S. government took no further steps to honor broken Indian treaties. Ames was a turning point in Native American history. It led to things like land being returned to natives and broken treaties being rediscovered. Ames also brought awareness to Native American rights, which would be seen on placards at colleges. Over its lifetime, most non-natives didn't support Ames, and saw him as ex-convicts. But eventually, Ames would change how government agents and Americans showed respect to Native Americans. Walking on the bones of our people, wherever you walk. That is something that people